All right, special guest today, Brett Vaughn. I work with Brett on the hernia mesh litigation. We talk probably every week, and he is the, I think, science guru of hernia mesh litigation right now. But tell us a little about your background, Brett.
Yeah, I was previously a nurse. I have a bachelor's of science in nursing. Worked as a nurse for about a year or so. Actually, is what got me interested in the pharmaceutical law side of everything. Was had some patients that were actually taking Fosamax and breaking their femur, and Fosamax is supposed to be for osteoporosis and make your bone stronger. So I was like, what is going on here? And started looking into it as a nurse. And I was like, oh, this is a whole area of law. So I ended up going to law school and getting involved in pharmaceutical and medical device law.
And if I'm not mistaken, you started out working on, was it transvaginal mesh first?
So I was doing a little bit of transvaginal while I was in law school, but I wouldn't consider myself like one of the main transvaginal mesh attorneys, but was doing tons of research into transvaginal mesh, into the documents that they had, the liability stories, and started to see the similarities of how it would apply to hernia mesh. And then started doing a deep dive into hernia mesh because, if anyone remembers a decade ago, it was all transvaginal mesh lawsuits. Everyone was calling about hernia mesh too, and no one would take the cases. We had a few that came in that were just really nasty injuries where the mesh was adhered to people's bowels and they were having to have their bowels cut out, and just these horrible infections, and the damages they're very high damage cases and really life altering injuries, and kind of piqued my interest. Like, kept doing research and trying to figure out, what are these different meshes? How are they made differently? Is there, a pattern to the injuries that I'm seeing that people are reporting? And that kind of got me going into the hernia mesh.
Who were the other lawyers that were working on this back, and what year were we talking about here?
I was probably looking into it around 2014-ish, and then really started kind of making more noise about it in 15 and 16, and then started kind of drafting the complaints, I would say probably around 2016, but I'm not positive on the year. But started drafting the master complaints for quite a few different hernia mesh products. And then people like Kelsey Stokes that really well started, catching an eye to it and getting involved, and started building out these different litigations that we have now.
So what's that been like? I mean, that's 10 years of your life. You're a young guy today. You were a really young guy back then.
I was, for the Bard MDL, I think I was 28 at the time I got on the executive committee. So I think I was probably one of the younger people at the time to be on an executive committee. And, there's a lot of mesh manufacturers, a lot of mesh products, which has made it very, very complex. There's the Bard litigation everyone knows about. There's Covidien that also has a big market share. Ethicon had a decent market share. Atrium, Gore. And so you have a lot of different defendants that you can't even sue at the same time because you're only using one person's product. It's not like you're getting, if you get implanted with multiple meshes, you still have to sue different mesh companies. But then each manufacturer has a whole lot of meshes they make. Just in the Bard MDL, we're suing over 20 meshes. The Covidien MDL is over 20 meshes. Significantly more work when it comes to experts and working things up, because you're having to work up every single mesh type and the defects and the warnings and the IFUs. Just made this take, obviously, a decade almost already. An entire career, though, for me. And what I know more than anything probably is hernia mesh.
Yeah, and Brett's really one of the interesting lawyers for people to know, because that pathway of actually figuring out the case and then finding a group of lawyers and bringing it to a litigation that has 24,000 Bard cases filed or something right now, maybe more than that.
Counting state court is over 30,000.
Right. So this is one of the people who has helped thousands of people. Mm-hmm. That's how I see it. And it's not the typical way that you would see people move into major products liability litigation. So, I mean, what would you say to young lawyers who want to go out there and kind of make a difference? Like, you did that. I think that's the thing that I respect really a tremendous amount about you and your firm. You're young people that are just filing lawsuits and going after people and doing good legal work.
Yeah, it was a lot different because when I was starting the hernia mesh litigations, there was no recall. And that's usually how these mass torts get started, is the FDA, where the company has recalled a product or a device. That kind of gives us the green light to go. Or there's been some really big studies that have come out showing that a specific device or drug is causing something. We didn't quite have that with mesh. Eventually Ethicon on their physio mesh did a market withdrawal, different than a recall. But that was after I had gotten stuff started, actually. And the reason that we didn't have, in my opinion, the reason we didn't have the FDA recalls and as much literature is because of the way hernia mesh is utilized in the United States and how it's tracked. So there's not a national database about every hernia mesh. Like, there's not something you can go into and be like, okay, everyone that's been implanted with Bard's Ventrolite ST. I want to see how many of them have had this injury. There's no database for scientists to do that research. Mesh is just mesh in the eyes of a lot of implanters. And so even when the studies come out, it's talking about mesh generally, and it's not talking about the specific meshes. The specific ones have different injury profiles. These meshes that have a coating on them that resorb, the resorbable coating goes away too quickly. It's sold as it's going to protect the bowels from this polypropylene or polyester. It doesn't. And then the bowels stick to the mesh, and you end up with these really bad bowel obstructions and stuff like that. We have other meshes that they make, like the Pro Grip that I know you're familiar with, Bob, where it has these grippers and everything. It's for an inguinal mesh. It causes a crazy amount of pain, and you can basically not remove it because of the way it's made. Then you have a mesh like the Perfect Plug, which is, it's shaped like a badminton birdie, and it migrates the direction of the point. But they're all very unique injuries. And so in order for us to figure this out, what we basically had to do was just take a lot of intakes on hernia mesh, start getting medical records, and then categorizing things. So we see this type of mesh here. What injuries am I seeing? Okay, this mesh, I'm seeing an infection almost every time. These other meshes, I'm not seeing many infections, but I'm seeing bowel obstructions all the time. And so we start to see this mesh is associated with this one's associated with this, why? And then so we have our idea of what we're investigating, what we're looking for. We know the end result, we just don't know necessarily why it's doing that. And so then first I'm looking at FDA adverse event reports, what the, doctors are reporting to them. I'm trying to look at literature if there is specific literature on a mesh. And then once the lawsuits are going, we're getting discovery from the defendants specific to what our theories are.
So when you start drafting these complaints and you start, okay, we're going to file some of these lawsuits, did you have any idea how big this was?
I knew it would be big. I don't know if I knew it'd be quite as big as it is. I mean, because transvaginal mesh was as large as it was, and we knew that hernia mesh was being used as much or more than vaginal mesh, we anticipated it would be pretty high. But when I first started, I was looking at a single product. I was looking at Atrium Secure Mesh initially because I was seeing high infection rates and high bowel obstruction rates. And so I actually made my criteria specific to stuff that I thought would make it an Atrium Secure Mesh. What happened though was I was getting all these different types of meshes. So we see the indications of, okay, this is probably an Atrium Secure. It has bowel obstruction and infection. I get the records back and it would be a Ventrolite ST, or it'd be a Symbitex, or it'd be a Proceed. And it's like, well, okay, it's not just the Secure that's doing this. And then that's when we started realizing, okay, it's all these meshes that have a coating on it that go away. All of those are having these injuries. That's kind of how it evolved.
And then that's been 10 years of evolution. Exactly. We're going to do it in 20 minutes right here. We're going to work through that, but it's to stick with that program. And we're still doing discovery in Covidien now. You probably took your first Covidien call 8 years ago or more.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of my clients would back that up. They let me know frequently, hey, we've been doing this for 8 years. I'm like, yeah, we have.
Yeah, so have I, every day.
Unfortunately, the FDA has not recalled these meshes. They're still selling them. The company's making a lot of money. And that's another aspect of why, in my opinion, these litigations last so long. It's a big difference when a company has recalled a product. They're no longer making money on that product, and they're now defensive, trying to defend lawsuits against it and wrap up their liability. We're in a very different environment here with something like Covidien, where they're still selling these products. They're still on the market. They're still making a lot of money every year off of it. They're going to defend the lawsuits tooth and nail because they're defending a current revenue stream.
As a consumer, let's say you go to the doctor, you have a hernia, and they're like, all right, well, we're going to put a mesh in. And you know this. What are you supposed to do? What's the other treatment option?
One of my dear friends, it just happened to him last year. I'm like, listen, man, you got to be careful. I wouldn't recommend that mesh.
Right.
He says, doctor says it's fine. I'm like, well, do what you got to do. I can tell you he's not so happy about it today.
Doctors aren't implanting things they don't think are okay. The doctors think that these are okay. They thought they were okay. That's why we're in the position we're in. It's the companies that aren't telling them everything they should. Companies that aren't putting things in the instructions for use. The doctors think they're using the right mesh. They're not going to use one if they don't think it's the right mesh. It doesn't mean it's the right mesh. There are still a lot of problems with meshes that are on the market. Like I was saying, in my opinion, Covidien's products are very problematic. We are in litigation with them. They are still selling them and implanting them in hundreds of people every day. I can tell you when I've been in the hospital before, the first thing I say is I better not wake up with a mesh in me. Absolutely not. I'd recommend anyone on any medical stuff, get a second opinion, especially if you have a very small hernia. If it's an elective procedure, then you're not, need an urgent repair. have another doctor look at it and see what their thoughts are. There's numerous repairs that you could do without a mesh that various surgeons of various skill levels can do. And there's a lot of different types of mesh out there too. There's the plug meshes, which I am very against any type of plug, and hernia surge. So a group of international hernia surgeons throughout the world came together for recommendations. It's called hernia surge, and recommended years ago that no one use the plug anymore. And that's, again, one that we see just a lot of injuries with plugs where it's chronic pain and it migrates. And if you have a little inguinal hernia and they're wanting to plug it up, I would get a second opinion. There's flat meshes they can use that aren't a plug. There's resorbable meshes that could be used, or non-mesh repair. Do your research. Don't just take what the first surgeon wants to do.
Yeah, I'm just so interested in the early days of the mesh of you. Was it really just you reading these documents alone and at your house and trying to figure it all out? Is that what it was?
All day for like months on years. We're talking, I would go on hikes with my phone and I'd find some cool place by like the creek and I'd be hanging out and I would just be going through FDA adverse event reports, on my phone. So I type in a specific mesh type and I'd hang out for an hour and I'd just read every single one of them. And I remember on like physio mesh, I was just seeing it's ripping, it's tearing. There's a hole in the mesh. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is happening all the time. And so I ended up putting a thing up on the website after I read all these adverse event reports on it about how they recalled the mesh. And then the attorneys for Ethicon sent me a cease and desist letter saying, we did not recall this mesh. It was a market withdrawal. You need to issue a public statement, which did not make me very happy. And so I issued a public statement on YouTube going through all their adverse event reports and why I assumed they recalled it as opposed to a market withdrawal. Because a market withdrawal is, it's not because of adverse events. It's something like packaging. Well, they have all these adverse events of it ripping and tearing. Their market withdrawal talks about how it has higher adverse event reports, but somehow they did a market withdrawal instead of a recall. So I did like an hour-long YouTube video on all the adverse event reports I had, and they quit sending me cease and desist letters.
Was anybody helping you at that point, or that was really just you?
At that point, it was just me. For like the Ethicon Proceed and PHS litigation later, I compiled everything into a big notebook. It might be downstairs. I might not have the notebook here, but then a bunch of attorneys from around the United States traveled to Kansas City. I put on a presentation and kind of pitched, what I thought the litigation, what our liability story was, and gave them binders. And luckily enough of them jumped on board, and we had a great litigation there. So
there's lawyers all over this country that are going through documents, that are thinking about cases, that are looking at cases. I mean, every lawyer who's worth anything has thought, hey, can I take down X, Y, or Z company, right? There's a guy out there who, if they hear this, like, what do you tell that guy? Like, what's your advice to the 20-something-year-old lawyer who thinks they think they got one against one of these big companies?
Find some allies. That's the most important thing. You're going against a massive pharmaceutical company. I don't care what law firm you're at. You're not going to do it by yourself. Even if you're at the biggest law firm, you need more attorneys, more resources to do it, and just the manpower that it takes. I mean, I know Bob, from the Covidien litigation, the amount of briefing, the amount of discovery, the amount of just everything that is going on constantly. You need support. And so that's the most important stage, of probably the litigation is, once you have the idea, you got to amass the troops. And so, that meeting we probably had 20, 30 attorneys at it for one of them. And we, 8 or so of us got together and did the litigation. The Bard one, Stokes got involved, Tim O'Brien, and, they're friends, and we keep pitching it to people until we have 30 attorneys, 30 law firms on one litigation. You need that power to push these litigations. Don't go out there and try and just hoard it all to yourself and think, oh, if I tell somebody I'm going to have less cases, this isn't going to be as good for me. That's not how it works. There's strength in numbers here, and it's good for all the attorneys nationwide to be working together and putting pressure on these companies.
It's fabulous advice. I mean, we meet every week. There's 10 lawyers, and 10 lawyers, we could probably use 10 more lawyers. I mean, it's easy to say millions of documents. It's hard to read 1 million documents.
Very hard.
Your law firm, where do they find more information about you, Brett?
NighGoldenberg.com. It's NighGoldenberg.com.
Great to have you on, Brett. Really a privilege. I'm so happy that our people are going to get to hear from you, one of the great legal minds right now in the national mass tort litigations, Brett Vaughn.
I really appreciate it, man.